Ruchem Aboim B'Shem Hashem B'Shem Iyar Shir. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's shir from Rabbi Yakov of Smith on stitches and Shabbos, when and how. To have the great schluss sponsoring a shir, call Iyar Shir at 718-851-8651 or email ist@yeshivanet.com. Rav Smith.
One of the challenging questions we've had during the summer, when people are out more often, someone falls and gets a pretty deep cut, whether it's a child or an adult. And the question is, the doctor strongly recommends getting stitches. And the question is it mutter to get stitches done on Shabbos or Yomtov? And I want to be meisameido once and for all. When it's a deep cut, there's always a chashash, possible chashash of sakana, if the bleeding doesn't stop, or more typically when there's an infection, either there or might have an infection. And once you're dealing with even a suffix in pekuach nefesh, the halach is very clear in Shulchan Aruch Shin Chav Ches Siv Beis, Hazorez Hareza Meshubach, Hashoyel Hareza Shoyfich Damim. So when you have even a suffix pekuach nefesh, you do what you have to do. Don't ask questions. Don't harass the doctor. If he says you need it, you do it. In fact, the Serb Shlomo Zalman in the tshuva was asked if there's a machlokes doctors. Roiv hold you don't need it, and some hold you do. So he says you go bust a miyat. So definitely in a deep cut there could be possible pekuach nefesh. We are absolutely, definitely not talking about even a suffix pekuach nefesh today. Today it's the question of stitches which might leave an unsightly scar. That's a nice halachos of saying that it's going to be in a lifetime scar. That's going to either ruin shidduchim prospect, or in an older person it's just going to be emotionally difficult. So it's what's called a cosmetics. You're doing it basically for cosmetic purposes. There's no real pekuach nefesh at all. And the question is it mutter to do stitches, whether a Yiddish doctor or a Goyish doctor? That's one group. The second group is today's modern world. There are alternatives. I'll soon explain each one, but there's what's called a butterfly stitch or a steri strip. There are surgical staples. There's liquid. Bandages called, there's glue. There's a fascinating question about dissolvable stitches. And basically, the real challenge is you can't delay, because they say within a few hours you could still make stitches, otherwise it's too late. So the Rav has to keep in mind that, when you're talking about a lifetime problem that he might cause. But then again, Shabbos is not hefka, and you have to know what's right. So the Rabbi has to know the halacha and the metzias, and makes it more challenging when you have a 2-day Yomtov. We just had a 3-day Yomtov, and there's no, could be waiting 3 days. It's definitely not an option. But I want to just make a point. Baruch Hashem, we should all be gesund and not fall. But even if you don't fall, but the matan schara of this sugi is we touch upon the major yisoidis of many the halachos of Shabbos that are negayah to everything besides stitches. So, like I say, sit back and enjoy. What could be an issa on a Yiddish from a doctor to make stitches? What's wrong with making stitches? So like every shaila, before you decide halach, you have to know the metzias. Stitches are very similar to sewing. You have a thread, a surgical thread of course, you have a needle, and you make more than 2 tfiras typically. A number of years ago, I fell. I got I had a deep cut. We had stitches. And the doctor was a fruma doctor. We were talking and learning, in fact, and I guess they must have given me anesthesia. And he takes a needle and a black thread. I remember like yesterday, and he starts sewing up my hand. I'm watching him. I didn't feel it because it was anesthesia, but it's very similar to regular sewing. Just it's your skin, not something else. Be'enai re'isi, like I say, mipsari echza, literally, that stitches is very similar to tfira. Now, what's taka the melacha? What are the parameters of melacha of tfira? So the basic definition of tfira, Rashi taka in Parashas Truma, Perek Chavav, Pasuk Gimel, based on Gemara, of course, when they took the 5 ureas, the 5 cloths, and they sewed it together. So from 5, or even 2, but from 5, you made it into 1. In other words, tfira is connecting 2 or more materials together. That's the of melacha. The telada is if you glue two papers or two cloths together. So basically, tefira is connecting two into one. Now, there's a different form of tefira, also in the Mishkan, and that is when there was a hole in the area, so you had to repair it. So you didn't add another area, you sewed up the hole. So either you connect two into one, or you repair by using sewing. But it's two forms of the same objective. Sewing repairs or connects. Now, oy bazoi, it's logical to assume that stitches is a form of tefira. In fact, it has both features. First, you connect the two parts of the skin that were cut, and also you're repairing the hole. It's not a very big hole, but there's some type of gap. And it's noteworthy. In English, the real word for stitches is suturing or sutures. We could say, the stitches, I guess that's the, quote, the yeshivish way of talking. But the right word is suturing. Stitches is very indicative of the problem. And in Hebrew, modern Hebrew today, it's called tforim. That's what stitches are. Tforim, or like tofar. Yeah. But before we say so, oy bazoi, stitching is mamash tefira, we have to step back for a moment. Because the basic klal by all of Hilchos Shabbos, it has to have tzuras hamalacha. And I'll give you a simple example. If a person grinds vegetables, chas v'shalom, it's a melacha d'oraisa of teiche. But he's allowed to smash the eggs to tiny pieces. What's the chilik? Ein teichen ela gedulei karka. Why? That's the Bar Shem's ratzon. Teichen is limited to gedulei karka. There's an issa of tzviya, melacha d'oraisa of tzviya, but we pass him yekid din ein tzviya ba'oichel. There's an issa of mareach, but the Ramah says in the end of Shin Chaf Aleph, miyekid din, you're allowed to smear food, you're allowed to put on the icing on a cake. In other words, it has to have a tzuras hamalacha. Now I'll ask you a simple question. Is toifa the tzuras hamalacha even when it's done to a human being? In other words, is every melacha applicable to a human being? Maybe some melachos are just not tzuras hamalacha. For example, you have a babysitter who's frustrated, this child is misbehaving, he needs a little rest. So if he takes the child, his mistress child, locks him into a back room, throws away the key for an hour, I'm going to rest. Is that a melach of tzeidah? Doesn't seem so. There's no issa tzeidah by a human being. How about someone that gets very involved in his suda, Rosh Rubai B'Shulchanai, and he's all dirty, and he washes his face and his hands. He was very dirty, now he's clean. Do we say there's a kibbus? If you put water on a clothing, it's awesome. So maybe there ain't kibbus ba'adam. So maybe we'll assume ain't toifa ba'adam. In the Mishkan there was no tefir by a human being, that's for sure. So you're all Shas Yidin, you have to, race through Shas. See how many times you could find the answer to this question. Is there a general exemption of ein blank, this melacha, that melacha by Adam? So what comes to mind, especially if you still remember from yeshiva days, ksubis davav amid beis, mapis mursa, puncturing a pus pimple, is a melacha d'oraisa either of bona or makah b'patish. Shulchan Aruch Shin Chav Ches, Siv Chav Ches quotes halacha. It's a human being. So we see either bona or makah b'patish is applicable by human being. Then, this is famous also, Rashi and Bereshis, the Shulchan Aruch Shin Gimel Siv Chavav, you're now allowed to braid hair in a very distinct way. Why? Bona. Become bona to hair, by even esatzela. So you see, by human beings, it is bona. Of course, if someone cuts nails or hair on Shabbos, even of a human being, it's melach of gauzes. Shulchan Aruch, the end of Shin Gimel, Siv Chaf Hei, that there's the issa of tzeveya applies to a human being. Coloring, whether it's lipstick or the makeup, we see by human being there are melachos. I'll give you an interesting mashal. We paskin, there's an issa of tikkun keli by toiveling a dish. Frag Gemara, so how could a person go to a mikveh? It's near a kameka. What do you have to say in Iyar? Could you say Ein Tikkun Ba'adam? The Rambam Melachos Shabbos Perik Yud Aleph Halacha Tezayin speaks about koisiv. Someone writes on his skin, there's an issa of koisiv. Mishtabura Shin Lamed Siv Chav Zayin quotes from a Sefer Koivus Rambam that cutting the umbilical cord when it's not needed for refuah is a melacha, the raisa. And interesting, the Chasam Soifa in Archaim Siman Ayin Aleph and the Chuvas, Be'alacha in Shin Lamed Aleph quotes him, if a moil cuts his fingernail to be able to perform mila properly with the fingernail, Chasam Soifa writes very strongly, he says it's bora, it's an ism in a Torah of boina kli gama v'chayshashani michatos. So we see boina, tikkun, tzayveya, numerous melachos. Of course, we have to mention the question of a woman that has too much milk. So to express the milk is the issa of mefarik. The only hat is if it goes to ibud. So I think we are comfortable to say, based on more than half a dozen sources, that we can't just categorically reject that there's no melacha by human being. Kibus. So I was thinking kibus is not such a raya that it doesn't apply to human being, because you're allowed to wash dishes or a pot on Shabbos if you need it, of course. Why don't we say issa of kibus? Teretz says kibus is when something is ingrained, the stain is embedded in a cloth, varaya, on a hard surface. There's no issa kibus. And the place we discuss leather, is it hard enough? But a human being, it doesn't get absorbed. Why not? Why is it mutter to lock up a child in a room? So that's pashit. It's not just the issa of tzeda is really taking away his shlita, taking away his morus, his freedom. A human being, you can't say you captured him. But I was a little disappointed. We can't find any makar for tofer specifically. So maybe it's a chatzi raya, but I think it's a good raya. The Shulchan Aruch in Hilchos Yomtov Tov Kuf Tes Siv Gimel quotes the Rashba and Aleph Tov Kuf Ayin Vav that on Yomtov, now this is rather, you don't see it that often, but it used to be very, very common. They would take a whole chicken, of course, geshacht in the chicken, and put the stuffing in the center of the chicken, the hollow center of the chicken, and sew it up. So the Rashba says you're allowed to sew up the chicken to keep the stuffing in on Yomtov. What about toifa? Oichel nefesh. Now, that means without the het of oichel nefesh, there would be toifa. Now, let's say there's no toifa by an animal, maybe only by begodim. So you see, definitely by an animal, there would be toifa, if not for oichel nefesh. So maybe it's not so much of a jump from a chicken to a person, but that's a chatzi raya. I did see Reb Chaskel Abramsky quote in Toras Yoledes, Perik Lamadal Ha'or Lamed Ches. That's Reb Zilberstein Sefer on Yoledes, and he said Mistavra, there's no issa toifa by human being. Why? Just like there's no issa of malabain, and he says fakerta what we said. Since you have to have a special gzeres hakosiv by even as a tzela, that's an issa of boina by human being, is matched without the gzeres hakosiv, it doesn't apply to humans. So he's noiter that there's no issa toifa by human being. The Tzitz Eliezer, Chelik Chaf, Simen Yudches, the Arletziel, Amavav, Tezayin, also seem to say, Ein toifa ba'adam. But as we saw, there are too many sources that other melachos do apply. And to quote Rabbi Yashiv in Nishmas Avram in the new print Archaim Amatov Kuf Pei Dalid, he said Rabbi Yashiv told him, and he's very reliable, this Mechab of Nishmas Avram, that there's at least a suffix deraisa in stitches, and therefore you have to be careful unless it's pikuach nefesh not to administer stitches. And he added, but before you take the person out to skila, consult only one more time. Now, he's not swearing in the court of law that it's vadei toifa, but it's a chashash deraisa. But a much more thorough discussion in Mincha Shleimer, Reb Shlomo Zalman's Tshuva Sefer and Yonah Simon Lamed Hey, he mamish discusses. The Gemara says there's an issa of boina by a human being, Maybe Topher is different. But then again, we see if you glue two papers together, there's an issa of Topher, a tilada. Why don't we say yesh Topher ba'ada? It's not the derech, it's not in the Mishkan. That's because they didn't need it. But today, when a person has a deep cut, that's the derech to sew him up. He says, just like the Rambam says, there's kaisiv by an adam, even though it's not typical, but when it's needed on a tattoo, it is kaisiv. So why don't we assume yesh toifa ba'adam? Now he says basically that toifa mamish kederech ha-toifrim has kol mechabe v'nasa echad. That is enough to say yesh toifa ba'adam. Now we would add daik v'tishkach l'chayra, and I stress the chayra. Both forms of toifa apply to a human being. You're taking two pieces of skin, putting it together, and you're repairing the whole. So we're pretty comfortable to say, yesh toifa ba'adam like roiv shitas. It's at least a safek derais. But here there's one point that we have to carefully consider, because if you think about it a little deeper, maybe none of tefira applies to a human being. In other words, you're going through the motions, but if you look closer, you're not really succeeding. And let me explain. If you know a little bit about stitches, stitching does not close the wound, does not close the gap. What it does is there's a hole or a cut, and you want it to heal properly. So you basically take the two skins and sew it together. That aligns the skin in a way that when the Bershtaim's Bria kicks in and the skin grows, so it heals perfectly. But no one should think that when you have a good doctor, he heals the cut or close the cut. That is incorrect. He aligns it, he makes it closer. Now, let's say the cut is an eighth of an inch open, so now it's a fraction open. But the real healing, the real connection comes from Bari Olam. The skin grafts and connects. So in other words, think about it. When you do stitches, you're not connecting the two pieces of skin together. You're bringing it closer that it should heal naturally. If so, it's not like the regular taifa of connecting two pieces, and it's not even that you're saying, I repaired the hole. You didn't repair the hole. You set it in motion that eventually the skin will close it. And Taka Ravozna Chelik Tes Ayin Dalit, he says, Mesupakani, Lamaisa, with a stitches or glue, you're only bringing it closer that it should naturally heal, but you're not closing the gap entirely. Rabbi Soyayin Kefishin Evan Yisrael Tes Chav Zayin, he says, you're setting it up, V'yizdabku me'atzma, but not that you close the hole. And I saw a very convincing argument, Vayan David Chele Gimel Chavav. He says, it's clearly not that you're closing the hole. He says, Lamar David Doima. He says, someone that's toifa, that only lasts for a short while, and someone else comes and solidifies it. Rather, by stitches, the Bari Olam solidifies it, but not you. I'll give you maybe a better marshal. Let's say I say I'm not a surgeon, but I want to help the person. They got a cut, so I volunteer to take my two fingers and hold the cut together for 24 hours. I hope I don't move, but I keep it for 24 hours. Did I make a maisa of taifa? I set it up that it could heal. Now, grab the stitches is much more efficient because I don't have to stand there. But this is the point. I saw Archa Shabbos and Chelik Beis Amid Shin Zayin. He says stitch is like putting in clips to hold it together, but it doesn't heal with your stitches. Better yet, Rav, the Mechaba of Shmir Shabbos Kilchasa, he says, I understand Mapis Mursa is Bונה, because when you puncture the pus pimple, there's a hole. Lahoitzi ulahachnis. It's done on the spot. Finished. But stitches is a process. You set the process in motion. Is that really a melacha deraisa of taifa? So we see a fundamental chilek between tofer and stitches. However, all the places that I mentioned don't say it's mutter. Rav Vosler says, Lamaisa, I have a suffix. The Evan Yisrael, Rabbi Yanka Fisher says, maybe it's like the teilada of sticking papers together. It doesn't happen right away. It has to dry, it has to glue. Rabbi Shlomo Zalman in Shulchan Shloim, there's a beautiful discussion in Refuah Chelik Beis, Amud Kuf Lamed Gimel. He says, maybe it's like Zoreya. Zoreya all agrees one of the Lamates melachos, but it doesn't happen instantly. But the fact that you put in the ground, it takes time to germinate, but that's the melacha. So maybe stitch is the same. By the bottom he says, but really it's not a raya. Because that's the derech of Zoreya, always a process. But tofer, you could do it instantly. So we see definitely there is a tzad to be makel, but not enough to be matir. The chilik is there, but then again, no one takes the plate saying it's not a problem. But there's another tzad, maybe to be matir stitches. The Ramah in Shin Yud Zayin, Siv Gimel, talking about tofer, actually sewing or gluing things. So Ramah quotes a shita, Yesh matirim, but tefira she'ena shel kayama. As long as it doesn't last, you're allowed to sew it. Ve'ein lahat b'fnei ha'maretz. We'll soon get back to that. But basically, just like kesher is only asa if it's kayama, so too tefira. Stitches that we put into the skin is always eina shel kayama. Depending on how deep the cut is, a few days, 7 days, maybe long if it's needed, but it's not forever. The Ramah says only be matir. Shalei b'fnei ha'maretz can't be matir. So let's see in Lamed Vav Tezayin, he's talking about a bandaid, but who I did in our case, he says, why is it also to do it in front of an ha'maretz? Because here you are sewing something, gluing something. He doesn't know alam this kayama, not kayama. He's going to be mezalzel in isurim. But says the Or Letzion, the ha'maretz doesn't even know that stitches or bandaid is b'chlal tefira. So his amaratzis is a maila. You put a bandaid on. Does he think it's tefira? So it's not a problem even in front of an amaretz. So that's why there's a good sat to say it's at least a lower level of an eina shel kayama. But the emphasis is, if you know about stitches, there's a different problem. Now let me explain. There's a melacha deraisa of making a kesher on Shabbos. One knot, l'chayra, shouldn't be an issa of kesher. What do I mean one knot? So imagine this is your shoelace. So you tie it once, like I'm doing. I'm sorry those that are listening without watching, but one knot to take two strings together, making one knot, is perfectly mutter. Now I'll ask you another question. Typically we have the me'il, the raincoats, they have a string in the hood. Now it's very, difficult when the string gets caught into the place where it is. You have to go fishing and take it out. So I have a great idea. I'll take the string as it is, and I'll make one knot, like I'm doing, and I'll pull it tight. So now, because there's a knot, it won't get stuck in the groove, whatever it is, in the area where it is. So is this mutter? It's only one knot. The answer is chas v'shalom. This is what's called Reish Chut or Reish Chevel, and the Svar is Poshet. When I take two ends and tie it together, it doesn't stay at all. So that's why it's mutter, look. But when I made what I just did, I take the Reish Chut and I tie it, it will stay forever. In fact, this one already has one. It's there, it stays. Oy bazoi, Reish Chut is an issa, doraisa of kesher shel kayam. Aga, the same is true with the garbage bag. People have garbage bags. I couldn't bring garbage bag, but this is just good. And to take the two, if it has two ends, and tie it with one knot like this, is fine, because it opens. But let's say you twirl the top. People do that, unfortunately. And you make a knot on the top of the garbage bag. That's Reish Chut. Oh. Now here's the problem when it comes to stitches. Because the doctors don't make stitches up and down like, they'll look pretty sloppy. They make one stitch and they make a knot. They make another stitch and make a knot on both ends. Says the Evan Yisrael, so Anka Fish and that tshuva, even if you hold the sewing motion is not tefira, but kesha is kesha, and it's kesha shel kayama, the knot lasts. So he says, that's why I'm worried about the concern of kesha. Forget about the sewing, but the kesha is a problem. But here again, as I told you, we come to another fascinating yisoid that's way beyond stitches. It's negeya to disposable syringes, and it's negeya to the countless number of shilas. Let's talk about stitches. The person goes to the doctor, he says, listen, I'm not a rabbi, you ask the rabbi, but I have to make a knot. So the person thinks, listen, he's making a knot at the edge of the stitch, but after 5 days, he's cutting the stitches and throwing away the stitches with the knot. So the knot is an eina kayama. It's only lasting at most 5 days. And some say up to 7 days, within 7 days is not kayama. But think about that, it's not so pashut. Because if you make a knot and you untie the knot, that's eina shel kayama. But the doctor says he's cutting away the stitches and throwing it out. So now the knot remains intact in the garbage. Then after a week they empty the garbage can and put it into the recycler, wherever they put it, but it never is opened. So now the question is, how do we define eina shel kayama? When you make a knot and open it like on your shoes, it's eina shel kayama. But the knot at the edge of the stitches lasts until it disintegrates. But you only need it for 5 days. How do you classify that? Is that kayama because it does last, or because you need it only for 5 days, it makes it eina shel kayama? So this is a brilliant Einfall, the Maral Diskin and the Chuvas, Konchesach and Simulamet Hay, has this very shaila, and he points to Gemara in Yuma Pei Zayin. Part of the Avodah Yom Kippur, they tied a ribbon around the horn of the Soyel Azazel. And he says, obviously, it was done on Yom Kippur. It's part of the Avodah. What about the Isaf Kesha? He says, maybe there's no Kesha Kayama because it goes over the cliff, and once it's over the cliff, you don't care what happens to it. So in other words, Kesha Kayama is not judged by how long it lasts, but how long you need it. But he says maybe it's not such a raya, because maybe with the constant turning and rolling down the cliff, maybe they're not opened. But he's more noita to be makel. Now, that has ramifications in halacha in a very big way. Let's say today, I'll give you one mashal. Today they have disposable syringes, needles. Doctor has to give a person a needle. He puts together 2 pieces, injects, and throws it in the garbage. Now, putting together this needle could last. Is that tikkun? Is that boina keli? Is that makaba patish? But then again, you throw it out a minute later. You don't take, if he takes it apart, as it's mutter. But if he throws it out as it is, this totally in Shuleb Diskin's Yisoid. Our knot is the same shaila. The knot lasts at the edge of stitches, but he doesn't use it. And indeed, the Tzitz Eliezer Chelik Chaf Sim Yotches is makel, even as far as the knot's concerned, because it's eina shel kayam. Now, of course, it's still Nisud Rabbanan, but maybe B'makom Tzarech is mutter. However, there is a tzad to be machmer. Shlomo Zalman in Shmir Shabbos Lamed Hey Chavav points to a Gemara in Sukkah Lamed Gimel and Beis. In fact, he wonders why Ariel Diskin doesn't mention this. The Gemara says if the knot's the wrong word, but the kesher of the Gimel Minim Lul of Dasim and Rav is opened up, you're not allowed to tie it on Shabbos or Yomtov. Obviously, Yomtov is muktzah besides, but you can't tie it on Yomtov because kesher shel kayama. Fregt of Shlomo Zalman, think about it. The knot of the Gimel Minim is not used for more than 7 days. I mean, it can't be more than 7 days because the Yom Tov 7 days. If you're doing it on Yom Tov, that means it's less than 7 days. Why does Rashi call it Kayama? It's less than 7 days. The teretz is if it will last, because after you use it on a Shana Rabbi, you put it on top of the brake front to burn it with the chametz, it lasts till Pesach. So it's not how long you need it, it's how long it lasts. And Itaka wonders why the Real Diskin didn't point to this sugya. So Shlomo Zalman says, this is a raya, you look at how long it lasts, not how long you need it. But he does point out, maybe the Gimel Minim is different, it's the cheshivas of mitzvah that makes it kayama. But everything else is totally in your use. Also, he mentions Chsam Soifa, fascinating Chsam Soifa. Chsam Soifa wants to say maybe the whole raya is not a raya, because you remember the Gemara in Sukkah, Daf Lamed Aleph, they were so poor, Hayar Marishin Lulveim Livneim. They would pass on the lulav from year to year. It must have been Yena lulav, but that's what they did. So it comes out that it is needed for more than 7 days. It's a year. So Shlomo Zalman discusses the same shaila about disposable syringes, and he says now with this understanding, it should be asa. It's not totally how long you use it, it's how long it lasts. If you go with Rashi's kipshutai. So we have two different ways of defining kayama. If you go to B'shulei Diskin's Yisoid, so then throwing it out makes it ain't a kayama. Shlomo Zalman's understanding, at least from Rashi, that it's totally how long it lasts. And I must mention the Rivosh in Kuf Chav Beis is mefurish lahachmer. You look it up, you'll see. The Masal Yo and Chelik Aleph, Siman Ayin, Sivkot Yud and Yud Aleph, and many Paiskim hold that you have to be choishish that this is considered kayama. So now we have another problem with stitches, besides the tefira, but the knot is a regular problematic knot. So that's why Lamaisa, to have a Yiddish doctor so make stitches, if there's again safik pikuach nefesh, don't ask shilas, do. If it's just cosmetically necessary, we can say at least a safik deraisa mitzat toifa, and a safik deraisa mitzad kesher. Now this leads to the next question. Okay, how about if I get a guy? Can I have a guy make the stitches? And again, we're talking about only for cosmetics. So the emes is, we all should remember the chaimer of Amir La'akum. You know, suffice what it says in Min HaShamayim, that's true as Min HaShamayim. One of the Bali HaToyser, Beinu Yankov, asked the Shaila Min HaShamayim, Siman Dalid, can I have a guy do for me an Issa D'Rabbanan? So the response that I quote, Leisige Bayod, Ki Sokol Yisokel, Ayore Yiyore, I don't want to touch that, Kol Negeya B'Divreyim, you start up with the Rabbanan, Kunageya B'Bavas Einai, you're playing with the Bernstein's pupil, Kaviyach, the Bernstein's eye. V'kama Mekaimus, Asu Chacham, Chizak Divreyim, Yoisim Mishal Torah. In other words, don't play around with Amir La'akum, or any Shvus, Fakert, Chaviv and Divrei Seifrim. One Rav told me people think that Amir La'akum is not just a heta, it's a way of life. Well, let me tell you, it's not a way of life, it's not a heta, it's Bavas Einai. But at the end of the day, Shulchan Aruch Shin Zayin Sif Hey, if you have what's called a Shvus to Shvus, a legitimate Shvus to Shvus, which means the guy is doing a melacha d'Rabbanan, for either Miktzas Chayli, Tzorich Harbe, or Mea Mitzvah, you're allowed to ask a guy to do melacha for you. The guy is doing a d'Rabbanan, makes a Shvus to Shvus. Again, Miktzas Chayli, Tzorich Harbe, or Mitzvah. Our case of leaving an unsightly scar is definitely a tzorech harbe. Again, even if it's not going to be dangerous, but it leaves a scar. L'loimi boy of shidduchable age, avada that's a tzorech. But even that, Taisus in Shabbos, Daf Nun Mabei is interesting. Taisus is discussing what's mutter ne'atzar. Nothing to do with stitches, obviously. But Taisus says, if im ein loy tzar, achar, ela shem is bayish leilach bein b'nei adam, shari, the same heta, de ein loch tzar godla mizeh. There's something called emotional pain that's as painful, if not more painful. So definitely the prospect that they might leave a permanent scar is at least a tzorech gadol. So why can we call a guy or ask a guy to do the stitching? Now, of course, you can't drive a car to get to the guy. We're talking about the only melacha is the stitching. But you're wondering, wait a minute, we just said that stitches could be a melacha deraisa, and kesher is a melacha deraisa. So all of a sudden you call a guy, where's the shvus to shvus? So one svar I saw that maybe since right now Lamaisi has a cut, maybe it's a tzarchei chayla, and stam tzarchei chayla nasa the akav even melacha deraisa. Now that I don't understand, because once you eliminate any chashash sakana, it's basically only for cosmetics. So why is he a chayla? But the svara that I think makes sense is on each of the isurim we have big question marks. Can we say bevadoi it's a melacha deraisa of taifa? We had svaras that maybe it's not a melacha deraisa, maybe it's just bringing it closer. Kesher shel kayama, Rabbi Shulei Diskin svaras ganz good. Even Rabbi Shlomo Zalman says maybe it's not a raya from the case of the Gimel Minim. And Lamaisa in Mincha Shleim himself, Tinyana that I mentioned, Shmir Shabbos, Lam Gimel Chavav, Rav Sternbach and Gimel Chav Gimel, Kuf Gimel, Devin Yisrael also, and many others say we could rely regarding Amir La'akum that stitches with the knotting is only the Rabbanan. Now you're holding by Shvus to Shvus, B'Makom Tzoyrich. Now, that's why Lamaisa, again, I can't say it's Vadai only the Rabbanan, but Amir La'akum is the Rabbanan, and it's enough of a Tzorah Gadol that we could rely on the Rabbanan aspect of it. Now, of course, if the stitching is needed, but it's not so important, even cosmetically, let's say a place where no one could see, or someone told me he once got a cut on his chin, so he went to a doctor on Shabbos, the doctor says, you'll probably grow a beard, you don't need stitches. And Kachavi has a nice, beautiful beard. So if you don't need it, don't forget, it's not a het gomor, but b'mokem tzoyrech, there is this tzad of Aidei Akum. Now you have to realize, if you go wait until Motzei Shabbos, that's the best option. Go to a yid, and he'll do it right. But very often, waiting a number of hours, it doesn't heal properly, so you have to know, we have this het Aidei Akum. Now, the question is, probably an hour and able, it's pretty common. There are no goyish doctors available. We have Hamish doctors in our neighborhood. You have to go driving to a goyish doctor. There's also no heta. So let me tell you a limited heta, which I saw Reb Shlomo Zalman and Mr. Yanke Fisher both suggest. Let's say the doctor is an erlacha. He looks at it and says, listen, this cut cannot be neglected. You have to do at least 5 stitches to either stop the bleeding or keep out an infection. 5 will take away any chashash sakana. If I do 3 more, it'll heal beautifully. If I do 5, there's going to be a scar. You ask your rabbi, tell me what you think. In other words, 5 amuta al pikuach nefesh. Can he just finish up and make 3 or more, whatever, that will close it up and leave no scar? So pashtis, hay l'chudei. Do 5, eliminate sakana, and stop. Especially if you hold that every stitch is kesher, safek deraisa, and a yid. What should be the tzad? And Takar of Nisan Karelitz in the Sefer Chutshani says, you do what you have to do. But Reb Shlomo Zalman has an Einfeld. In Shulchan Aruch Shin Amar Aleph Beis, based on a Gemara, a moil on Shabbos has a mitzvah to do mila even though it's a melacha. But let's say he does the mila and leaves what's called tzitzin she'eina ma'akvin es hamila. He doesn't do a great job, and there are little strands here and there. Very hard to teach what it means, ein ma'akvin hamila, but he doesn't do a perfect job, but he's yaitze as it is. Don't touch it up on Shabbos, because you're doing chavala shaloi l'tzayr. After Shabbos, most place mold, you should touch it up. But once he's going with the mila and he didn't yet stop, he's allowed to do even sichei makvin es hamila. Zokt Reb Shlomo Zalman, maybe the same applies to stitching. Once you have a heta to take needle and thread and start stitching, and as long as you don't stop, maybe you could even do the tfiros that are not pikuach nefesh. Maybe the extra tfiros are like the tzitzin she'ein ma'akvin es hamila. Now this at first glance is very hard to accept, because the heta is not once you're doing it, you're allowed to do it. There's no heta to Mechal Shabbos for no reason. The heta of doing tzitzin she'ein ma'akvin es hamila is because it blibes a hiddur mitzvah. to do the mitzvah properly. So hidden mitzvah doesn't justify lechatchila doing melacha, but to finish up you're allowed to. But there's no hidden stitches. So Shlomo Zalman, I've either thought of that, and he seems to have Varna when he says that just like the het of tzitzin is because it's gemar mila, this is gemar stitches. So a new svar, and he says the Avnei Nezer in Yeridei Chelik Beishin Chav Ches says the same svar regarding mitzitza, that it's a gemar ma'isa, lav dafka hidden mitzvah gemar ma'isa. Okay. Rabbi Yankiv Fisher and Evan Yisrael that I mentioned has the same Einfal, the same heta of tzitzin she'ei makvin esamila, but he says it's a big makam l'chalik because it has to be a heta als mitzvah, and there's no mitzvah here. The Archa Shabbos also in Amud Shinches asked this kasha. It's not, there's no heta of mitzvah, but he has a different factor. And he says, let's say the doctor says, if I do 5 stitches, it will heal, but it'll take longer. When I give the few extra ones, it's more secure, it will heal quicker. So it could be that is like, not a hidden pekuach nefesh, but a mailen pekuach nefesh. So you're more connecting it to pekuach nefesh, not for cosmetics. The Evan Yisrael, after saying this heta, he says, but we have a problem. Because what about the knots at the end of the stitches? For that, how does there heta that you were doing the stitches, but the knotting is not necessary? Rav Sternbuch in the Tshuvas Chelik Gimel Kuf Gimel, he also asked Shlomo Zalman's analogy to tzitz and makvan amil. There's no hidden mitzvah here, but he has a different cheshbon that once lamaisa you did the 5 stitches that removes the pekuach nefesh, it's considered tofur. The extra stitches, he said, lashon of ein tfira achat tfira. Once it was sewn, 3 extra are not making it sewn. It's making it better regarding a scar. But he says that in the Mishkan it was tfira, not extra tfira, and he says it's an ein tfira achat tfira. Okay, if you like it, that's what he wants to say. My point only is that there is a heta, if needed, this is even Aida Yisrael, to have the doctor start pekuach nefesh and complete it because of the cosmetic reason. Rabbi Shlomo Zalman throws in another tzad to be mekel, and that's the famous Magid Mishnah in Hilchos Shabbos Perek Beis Halacha Hey, that his chiddush is when you have a question of pekuach nefesh, oisin kol tzarchei mila, even those that are not absolutely pekuach nefesh. Let's say the chayil says, I need a newspaper, I have to relax, I want a newspaper. It's not going to die without the newspaper. So up to the Magid Mishnah, and that's where the Paiskim learned the Magid Mishnah, it's hutra. So this chayla is now pekuach nefesh for the 5 stitches. So maybe whatever he needs, you're allowed to do. I had a little bit of problem with that because after you do the 5 stitches, he's ois chayla. So what's the justification? The extra 3. Now he's ois chayla. The case where the chayla tells you to go buy a newspaper, he's a chayla from beginning to the end of the ma'isa. So that's mutter. But here, if you make it into 2 sections, the 5 he's a chayla, and now he's back to a regular person. But I guess the heta is he tells you he wants to 8 now. Maybe that's tzarchei chayla. So I definitely could say that although there are those that are mekel, that the doctor could, the Yiddish doctor, the Frumma doctor, could do the 5 plus the 3, but Lamaisa, as I told you, the Chutshani and Chelik Dal, Amud Kuf Peites, and that's the Pashtis. Why does one matter the other? But certainly, to have a guy that do this, the stitches and the extra, that avadu mutter, like we said earlier, even cosmetics by a guy is mutter. Hasoymach on these paiskim to even go to Yiddish doctor to do both. The last group of questions are certainly very interesting because you see how once we have the Yisai, we could deal with new questions. Today they have what's called, not today, it's pretty for years already, dissolvable stitches. Basically, it looks like regular stitches and it could last. But once it's put into the human body, it's a chemical reaction. After X amount of days, it dissolves on its own. In other words, if you use it not in a human body, it will last. but it's the chemical reaction to the human body. So the question is that a heta mitzad atzmai? In other words, to go to a Yiddish doctor and let him do cosmetics purely. Maybe the fact that it doesn't last bechefza, quote unquote, it makes it an automatic eina shel kayam. Okay, it's still an istirabanan, but is that a better option than regular stitches? So if you're a lamdan, you might remember Gemara, Shabbos Kuf Yud Beis. Gemara says Rabbi Yirmiyah had his shoelace tore, so they advised him take a gemilach, a reed grass type of material, and use that as your shoelace. Why is that mutter? So the way the Rambam says, the Bekitza with the Chayodim and Chavav Halacha Ches points out, because this gemilach does not last. After a while, it falls apart. So something that dries up and doesn't last, there's no melacha. So maybe dissolvable is like gemilach. So it's bechefza and a keshesh shel no matter how long you want it to last. However, think about it, there's a big chiluk. Because the gemilach, you would love to have it lasting forever. You would really want it, but it just falls apart. It's very shvach in its own metzius. But the dissolvable stitches, you made it to dissolve. You don't want to keep in your body forever. So it's made to last, let's say, I'm just giving a mashal 5 days. And it lasts 5 days. So that's a real kayama. It lasts as long as you want it to last. And that's why the Chutshani is in Chelik Aleph, Amid Reish Chaf. He feels that dissolvable is the same melacha deraisa. It lasts as long as it's intended to last. That's not Eina Kayama. Eina Kayama means you would want it to last, but it falls apart. This is a real Kayama. I also saw in the Sefer Teres Malachis in Amid Tzaddik Gimel, he has a really interesting Einfall, and he says the fact that if you don't put it in the human body, it will last, that shows that it's really thread. Navas, you want it to dissolve, but you want it to last as long as you need it. He says, you know what it's like? If someone makes a permanent knot, and there's a fire coming down the road, and will burn up the fire, burn up the knot. Hayal al das that it's considered a kesher, she'en shel kayama. This is a kesher kayama, but you want it to have a life expectancy of 5 days. And that's why Lamaisa, the quote from this in Karel, he quotes this in Karel, it's that also, now I saw it in the Sefer, that this is considered a kesher shel kayama. Is it better than regular stitches? Maybe a little better, but not much. Okay. What I found really gishmak, because the problem, of course, for tfilas nashim and stitches is a harrowing experience, because stitching typically is a chatzitza. So the question is it an option to use dissolvable stitches? So I was thinking it could be it's totally zebazeh. Because if you say dissolvable is not a metzius, then maybe it's takenach chatzitza. Now, of course, if the stitches are put in a place that is irritating or it's sticking out, if it's makbid is makbid. But let's say it was done well, no one feels any pain, it's not disturbing, it's not distressing. So taka, I saw the Shulchan Shloima in the Refuah, Chelik Gimel, Amid Yud, and the Shevet HaLevi, Chelik Tes, Kuf Ayin Zayin, Rav Sternbuch, and Alf, Tov Kuf Ches, all say that dissolvable stitches do not pose a chatzitza problem. Because it's not noticeable, it doesn't disturb, and doesn't last. It's not enough on the map to make a chatzitza. Now I was thinking, would Rav Nissen Karelitz agree? Because he holds that's its existence. And Taka, I saw the Chutshani in Hilchas Nida, Amid Reish Peites, he says that dissolvable is a problem of chatzitza. So it could be a little of a shitasa of how to understand the metzias. But I really could understand, even if you hold Taka, like we said, it's a problem of tefira. But something that doesn't last doesn't pose a chatzitza issue. And I think the most place can make, if it's Taka not disturbing, it would not be a chatzitza. But certainly better than regular stitches, that is a chatzitza. Again, tfilas nashim, you have to ask a shayla, each case differently, but there is a tzad to say that dissolvable is less of a chatzitza than a regular stitch. Now the next shayla that you hear, and you might think it's a joke, but it's not, doctors will use staples to close the wound. Of course, surgical staples, not regular staples, but it's basically similar to staples used on paper. Is that less of a problem on Shabbos regarding tofar? So I think all the poskim agree, the Shmir Shabbos, Chav Chazayin, and a host of others, that basically stapling two papers together is a tolda of tofar. Because tofar is lav dafka sewing. A tilada of tofar is amadabik niyaris. So why isn't a staple at least like medabik niyaris? It's a hard material. So what? If it does a job, it's a derech bekach. The Chutshani says this, and many other poskim say this. So it makes sense, if you're using that medium to stitch a cut, it's the same tefira. Now, you want to say, like we said earlier, stitching is not really tefira mamish, it holds it together, fine. But it's not any better than regular stitches. Now, let's go, I'm going in order so you could see how one leads to the other. They have today what's called, actually also a much older Metzias, it's called a butterfly stitch, or basically steri strip. Now, I don't have one, so I couldn't bring it, but it looks like an H. Basically, it's like a bandaid that goes on the cut, holds it together, but there are two glued sides on both sides that also go onto the area. So it's a very secure bandaid that hopefully keeps the cut in place. So instead of running to a doctor, he has to sew it up, whatever, you know how to do it right, you put on this H bandaid, so it holds the wound in place, and it's reinforced on both sides. Is that a problem of tofar on Shabbos or Yomtov? So here, logic dictates that it shouldn't be a problem. Because here, there is no ma'isa tefira. Unlike dissolvable stitches, or unlike a staple, the stapling is the ma'isa tefira. This is basically, instead of having someone volunteer to hold the cut in place, you use a band-aid. But there's no ma'isa tefira. And taka, those that are machmir, Shulchan Shloim I saw, and the Orchos Shabbos, who are machmir by using stitches, but this parfar is called, I guess that's the modern Hebrew word, but this butterfly stitch is not a ma'isa tefira. It works, so you're a lamdan, you know how to do things right. It's no different than holding it in place. The challenging question is, today also, they use it also for years, they use glue, not of course regular glue, but surgical glue to keep the wound in place. So now the question is, we have options. Is it like sewing, like staples, or is it like the band-aid, the butterfly band-aid? So here, it's not so pashut like the butterfly, because gluing is a bona fide ma'isa tefira. Varaya hamadabek niyarais is an issa of tofar. So if glue can be used as a medium of tefira, it makes sense that surgical glue that makes the connection should be awesome. And taka, I saw Rav Falk in a Sefer Zach V'Shama, and other svarim say that glue is no different than regular tefira ayadei glue. The Shmir Shabbos in Lamed Hei Chafei is Meikov, it doesn't bring any makar, any svara. I'm not sure why, but this is what he wants to say. The Even Yisrael, that's Mr. the end of his tshuva, that after he goes through the whole sugya, he says, I heard today they use glue. Use glue. Now, I don't know if he means it's entirely mutter or better than tefira, I'm not sure. But he does say glue seems to be better than sewing. Now, what they have, which is really fascinating, is called officially liquid bandage. That's one of the slur names for slur. But basically, it's similar to glue, but you have a aerosol can, you shake it, and you spray it onto the wound. So that's l'chayr similar to glue. You're using glue to put two things together. But I have a different problem why maybe glue is better. Because lamaisa, whipped cream in a can, of course not tofar. But the problem is that moiled. Because you're taking a liquid and using the gas to make a solid. If you assume that whipped cream is solid, you're making from a liquid to solid. You're doing a biyadayim, you're pressing. So we see making from a liquid to a solid with an aerosol is moiled. So if you're making from an aerosol spray into a solid glue, that should be the issa of moiled. So glue is glue mikar ulubsaif. But here if you're making it, it should be moiled. So probably the glue is a little better than this aerosol can. But besides that, if glue is a form of tefira, this would also be a form of tefira. So I think the order, I go from best to worst, so to speak. The butterfly is the best option, because that I don't think anybody's machmir. I got it, Rabbi Yashav was machmir, tak quote, if I had to mention the Mishmas Adam, the Mishmas Avram, but almost all paiskim are mekel. Glue is better, is not as good, but also good. Spray is a little less than glue. Staples is worse. Stitches, dissolvable, and even regular, and certainly regular, is probably the worst. Just a few more questions once we have this sugya. How about using a regular bandaid, non-medicated bandaid? So the emes is, you think about it, you take off the tab and you put it onto your skin. Why isn't that taifa? Sticking onto my finger. So the answer is, maybe it's true. But then again, no one keeps a bandaid for just more than a day or so. So Oibazoi, it's tefira she'eina shel kayama. Rather, Moshe has a chiddush, and Moshe says tefira with glue, that's a telada. That's only if it sticks on and it becomes one. What's the praba? Because you have to tear it apart. Because the opposite of taif is kareya. If you glue two pages together, you can't open it. You have to tear it apart. So gluing papers, taifa, madbik niyares is taifa. He says a bandage like this, which it peels clean, maybe it's not taifa. Post-its, all these new inventions, basically, it comes on and off. Diapers, the tabs. So Ramosha would be a bigger kula. But even if you don't go with that kula, this is a tefira she'eina shel kayam. But here the paiskim caution, do it right. Because if you do it like I'm doing it, you put it as it is and totally onto the finger. So now it's at the length of the finger. You take it off and throw it away, no problem. It's eina kayama. But typically you wrap it on itself. So you put it on the wound and you go around and you put one edge of the bandage on the other. After a day or so, whenever you change it, you typically don't open it because it's harder. You slip it off. Now you're slipping it off and throw it away. What did you do? You threw away a kesher that's going to last. So you're back to my old diskin versus Shlomo Zalman. So if you do it right, don't do it wrong. So wrap it on the finger, not on itself. A gauze pad, sometimes a person says, you know what, I don't have to go to stitches. I'll take a gauze pad, and I have tape. Can I make my own, treatment on Shabbos? So obviously cutting pad or cutting tape is mechatich, that's a needed mechatich. We're talking about he cut everything before Shabbos. So you think about it, the problem is taifa. Because you're putting the tape onto the gauze pad, and that's not coming off so quick. Even Moshe would be moida that that's a real taifa. Because you can't just peel off the tape from the gauze pad. And besides that, you take off the pad and throw it in the garbage. So both heterim don't apply by gauze pad. Someone asked me, I don't know what the shaila is, but I'll mention it, an ace bandage, using an ace bandage on Shabbos or Yomtov. So an ace bandage and that elastic thing that goes around, what's the problem? There's no taifa. And he was worrying about refuah. So refuah is only an issa on ingesting medicine. If you have a treatment that you do, let's say exercise, but there is a medicinal alternative, then there's an issa of refuah. But if there is no medicinal alternative, certain exercise that there is no medicine, you're allowed to do on Shabbos. Because there's no isra on an action unless there is a medicine corresponding to that. To my knowledge, the ace bandage is included in that heta. The clip doesn't make a hole, the clip goes into the existing hole, so you're not making a hole. But maybe last but not least, the most important, whatever you do, please remember this, that doctors say that the biggest sakana in a cut is the infection if there's dirt in it. If someone decides to wait till after Shabbat, let's say he thinks he's not worried about waiting, clean it well. because sometimes when you cover a wound or make it stitches when there's dirt inside, that's the biggest sakana. So Breish is bar, the first thing is gesund. If there's a cut, clean it well. We should all be gesund. I got to talk to you all. As you got. Go ahead. Okay.
Shame Irgen Shooter like to be a Shakar or Smith for today's share. To have the great sister sponsoring a share call Irgen Shooter 718-851-8651 or email ist@yeshivanet.com. Bez Hashem after Kaddish, or Smith will say Sikkim of today's share. Chananya ben Akasha Omer. Lot Zakadish Baruch Hu Zakis says Shel Figure Hibram Torah Mitzvah Shanema Adonai Chofes and Sidka Yagdol Torah V'Yader. Okay, Rabbi Smith is going to sew up today's shear on the stitches and Shabbos.
Akapatish. Okay, just we learned today, hopefully, Bez Hashem, it's clear that there are two forms of taifa. Both the rice is either attaching two or more cloths or repairing a hole by using tefira. Stitching, mitzarech, it seems very much to be a melacha of taifa. When you look closely, there is a fundamental difference that really nothing changed. It just became closer. It's sort of make a grama to put in motion the Rabbi Shloim's bria of closing the wound. But based on that alone, none of the paiskim are actually makel. And basically, since we proved that there's no general exemption of ein toifa b'adam or ein boine b'adam, we have to be chaysh alish for melacha deraisa in stitching of any form, whether it's connecting two pieces of skin or actually closing up the wound. And as we said, it's at least a melacha deraisa. So the problem, of course, is also the fact that stitching employs a knot, a kesher, but roish chut, and every stitch there's a knot on both sides, so that makes it a melacha mitzad kshira. Now the only question is, if you make a knot that you don't untie but you throw away, so it's only functional for a short time, but it lasts much longer. Is that considered kayama? So we have another suffix deraisa to consider, and that's why the paiskim say aide akum loimi boy. I should have mentioned this before. If there's any chashash sakana, you have to do whatever's needed, and hashoyel hareze shoyfer damim. But today's sugya is cosmetic purposes only, no sakana. So aide Yisrael we're not makel, even though again we had sveikas in both. But Aidi Akum, it's enough of a tzara gadol to allow a guy lechatchila to make stitches purely for cosmetic purposes. If 5 are needed for pekuach, 5 stitches are needed for pekuach nefesh, and they add a few more, it'll make it perfect. So there are stadim to be makel, but again, Aidi Akum, that would certainly be mutter. And Asaymach and Rishleim Bezalman and talk about Rav Fisher, the Chayra, there's Yashlam Yilismach, although Rav Fisher at the end points out that the knotting is a problem. To be Saimach on the Magid Mishnah also, that Sarchei Chayla, Yesh Bei Sakana maybe is mut across the board. But basically, stitches as they are problematic. Dissolvable stitches, we said, should be treated like regular stitches. It's not like the gemilach. Staples is a form of stitching. It's like medabek neyaros. The butterfly seems to be mutter kamat l'chaladeis, the butterfly stitch, the steri strip. Glue and spray is one problem because it's using glue, and also the spray might be moiled. The bandaid, it can be used on Shabbos. It's no refu, of course, but on itself is a problem because it remains. So better put it on the skin itself. Gauze and tape is a bad combination because that's a tefira from the tape to the gauze. Ace bandage is mutter, and if there's any cut, clean it well. That avoids the sakana. Yes, Rabbi.
Started already. it's a